and had to do the entire gig with my saxophone resting on a stool.
80 professional, grizzly old classical musicians that are expecting the young guy to make all the mistakes.
I don't want to start telling kind of, let's call them blue jokes.
You see, Joel, when you said it that way, you made me feel really old. G'day, it's Nigel here. Welcome back to the Sax School Online podcast. Now, unfortunately, we see sax players making the same mistakes on gigs over and over. And if you've ever been guilty of some of the things that we're going to be discussing today, then don't worry, because we've got some good advice for you in this episode. And if you're getting ready to maybe start gigging, then you want to stick around today because we can give you some help to avoid making those mistakes that most sax players make. Oh, hey, real quick, if you do love the podcast and you love learning how to play saxophone, could you do us a massive favor and maybe share this podcast episode with somebody else that might also appreciate it? It'll really help us to reach some more friends like you, so thanks a bunch. So it's going to be a great conversation today, and to help me with this, I'm joined by Joel from the Sax School Tutor team. Right, let's get started. So Joel, I don't know about you, but no one ever actually taught me all these things. I kind of had to learn them along the way and made plenty of mistakes myself. How about you?
Oh, well, without a doubt, always making mistakes. And that's how you learn, isn't it? You make mistakes and you learn from it. But when you get to the stage that we've got to, I think you've made all the mistakes you're ever going to make and learned the lessons the hard way. So I think that's what we're going to talk about. Just some things for everyone to think about as they start moving into the realm of gigging.
You see, Joel, when you said it that way, you made me feel really old.
Well, I'm just as old, don't worry.
Oh, okay. So the thing is, going out and gigging is a craft, and you are your own business, really. So it's really, really important to be thinking about the customer and thinking about you as a business. I know it's a bit weird talking about businessy stuff as musicians, but really when it comes to gigging, that is what it is like. But I reckon we could break down these points into two elements. There's the things that happen before you go to the gig,
yeah,
and then there's the things that happen when you're actually at the gig.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I think the big one there is before the gig, especially when you start playing and performing, your focus is so much on that gig. You kind of forget all the things that you might need to do before that gig. Yeah. You know, so for example, just from the point of view, you might not be able to warm up at that gig. You might be going straight on stage. So making sure that you do a bit of playing that day is really important, and make sure your sax is in good order and it's working and you've tried out your reeds and stuff like that and just warmed yourself up. It's really important. You do that if you were practicing. So definitely need to do that if you're going to do a gig. So, I mean, how about you? Do you do?
Absolutely, 100%. You know, and depending on the type of gig, it can be even more important. So, for example, a long time ago, I was doing a lot of full-on classical performing, which is terrifying. Like sitting in a big concert hall with 80 professional, grizzly old classical musicians that are expecting the young guy to make all the mistakes. You've got to warm up before you go. But you know what? I'm going to add something extra to that, Joel, because it's not just about warming up and preparing for that particular day. But another really big thing is actually doing your homework and learning the material before you get to the gig. So this is important if you're doing a high pressure classical gig, but you know what? It's also important if you're doing a solo gig or a DJ sax thing, or maybe playing with a new jazz group where you've got to learn a couple standards that you don't know.
Yeah, without a doubt, the preparation for a gig starts well before the day of the gig. Not just from the point of view of making sure that you're familiar with all the material and that you can actually play it and you know what's going on, but from the point of view of maybe what the rest of the band's going to be doing. Listening to recordings is always a great thing to do if they're available, and you know, maybe getting some previous recordings of previous gigs is always a good thing to ask for as well. So anything that can help you feel more comfortable on that day, because it'll make you play better at the end of the day. That's what we want. We want to play better, and all the old grizzlies will be impressed and ask us back the next time.
You never know. It could happen. It could happen. Actually, that's a really great point you made there about listening to lots of recordings. I think that's super important. And we talk to our Sax School members about that quite a lot, don't we? And the other thing that we talk to our members a lot about is what we call performing practice. So factoring in some time in your practice as you're leading up to your performance, where you treat your practice session like a performance. So if you're working with a backing track, you put the backing track on and you play from top to bottom. with the mindset that you're doing a performance. And that does change things because you tend to be a little bit more cautious about taking risks. You're more cautious about all the little details in your playing as well. But it's a great way to prepare you for then how you're going to feel when you're actually out under pressure.
like a solo dress rehearsal.
Yeah.
Basically, which is really important. And then there's all the kind of organisation of things. It's making sure that you remember everything you want to take, and it's probably worth having some kind of little list somewhere just as a double check before you leave, because particularly when you start out, you're quite excited, or a bit nervous, and it's really easy in that mental state, if you like, to kind of not think about just the basic things you might need to remember. So just making sure that you're taking some water with you. It might be difficult to get a drink there, having some water in your case, making sure you've got spare reed, your saxophone, your sling. And I've definitely done that one. I've forgot my sling on a gig when I was younger and had to do the entire gig because the gig has to go on with my saxophone resting on a stool. It wasn't the best look, but, it had to be done. And from that, I literally went out and bought like 4 slings, and I had one everywhere. I had one in my car and one in my case and a spare one in my case and one in my coat, because I never wanted that to happen again. So you definitely learn these lessons the hard way, but it's preparation, and also it's that, your diary as well. It's knowing when to leave, when to get there, making sure you turn up early. There's lots of things to consider. It's not just
definitely
jollying out on the morning and going, great, I've got a gig, and turning up and hoping it's all going to go right, because generally they don't if you do that.
Well, the thing is, the more you do it, the more confident you get about everything. And that packing thing is a really important one. I think most of us have done that to some degree. You've forgotten your sling. Hey, I've never done it, but I've spoken to people who've arrived with their saxophone case with no saxophone in it. And actually, that sounds hard to believe, but if you're doing like I've done a lot of gigs where you have to bring a lot of instruments, a couple of different saxophones, a flute, a clarinet, a piccolo, and you're in a hurry, there's traffic on the M1, it's easy to make those mistakes.
I've been at plenty of gigs where I've seen musicians forget their instrument. Full stop. They've turned up and wandered in with their suit bag and stuff, and then you could see them looking at their other hand and then running back to the car, hoping that it's going to be in there, and it's not been in there, because they've rushed out the door. So these are about being professional, aren't they? That's what we're talking about. It's kind of these little extras that make the difference between being professional or not being professional at the end of the day.
100%. There's just one more thing. So we talked about looking after your practice. We talked about like warming up. We talked about preparing and learning the music and doing performance practice as well. We talked about making sure you've got a packing list, got all of your stuff, planning your route, and knowing your timekeeping so that you can get to the gig in a timely fashion. And by the way, kids, make sure you always get there way earlier than you think you need to. Trust me, there's nothing worse than running late to a gig. I might have done that once or twice. It's an awful feeling.
It really is, yeah.
Even an hour early. Get there an hour early. 2 hours early. Yeah. There's one last thing I wanted to cover in this part, which is the before the gig preparation. And that is, if you're in that situation where you're starting to go out and do paid gigs, whether that's professionally or whether it's as a hobby thing, even if you're just playing for friends, I think another element that really needs to be factored in there is actually communicating with the person that you're playing for. So make sure that everybody knows exactly what's happening, that you've got a clear agreement in terms of times and how much they're expecting for you to play and where and what's available for you. And do you need power? How much space do you need? Like, those conversations are often forgotten, but they can make a big difference between a gig being uncomfortable and everything running smooth.
Oh, without a doubt, that's so important, because a lot of people they have a really nice image of having music at their wedding or at their event or something like that, but they don't really think about the minutiae of that, and that's our job to do that, So a lot of people think jazz is literally everything. So they hire a jazz band thinking that you're going to be able to play some ABBA and going to play a bit of this and a bit of that, and you're just not set up for that. So you've got to really communicate with them what type of music you play. It's really good to try and agree a set list to some degree, or at least a rough set list with them, so they understand exactly. You can send them recordings, never mind us listening to recordings, or get them to send you a playlist of things like, so at least you know what they're expecting, because there's nothing worse than turning up thinking that you're a background jazz trio and it turns out you're the main disco entertainment.
Hey,
you know,
we've all been there though.
Yeah, and it happens all the time. But that's down to. And it's not really their responsibility to do that communication. It's your responsibility as the musician to tell them what service you're going to provide and what they should expect. And like you said, the timings and stuff, you don't want to turn up and, it starts kind of 4 hours later than you expected because maybe you've got another gig after it.
Or a common one that I've seen is that people who've not booked a band before don't realise that musicians need to have a break. Every now and then.
Yeah, and eat and drink and need power.
And
somewhere to park.
Yeah.
And things like that. So there's lots of things, there's lots of things to just communicate. And they're all just very nice conversations. We're all quite often when you say these things to the client or the customer, that you can see the surprise on the face of that they've not thought of that, because they're all quite obvious things, but they're just looking forward to planning the party. And that's, we want to take that pressure off them. That's our job, and they can have a good time and listen to some good music.
Hey, just real quick, if you're enjoying the podcast episode today, don't forget to follow our podcast. And hey, if you're really feeling motivated, it would be awesome if you had it within you today to give us a 5-star review. That would just make our day. Right, Joel, so we've talked about all the stuff that happens before we even get to the gig. But what about the things when we get to the gig? Because that's a whole new set of potential mistakes there.
Sure, yeah. So when you get there, it's about, you need to go and scope out where you're playing. So quite often you see people, they'll load up with all the stuff and they'll start traipsing in only to find, 200 people they've got to kind of get through. You need to go in. That's another reason to get there early and just scope out where you're playing, how you're going to get there, have a chat to not just the client, but have a chat to the staff there. How do they want you in? Because they'll actually know more about the venue and how it works and where PowerPoints are and all these kind of things if you need them than anything else. So just going in and having a wander around and familiarising yourself is a really good thing to do when you get there. And then you know your routes as the rest of the band's turning up, particularly if you're the band leader. You can tell them exactly where to go. Otherwise, it can turn into a bit of chaos and there's cymbals falling in the middle of the the dance floor and all this kind of thing. So that's always a good thing, definitely. I think, when you turn up.
Yeah, definitely. Or 6 people from the band all asking the same question of the staff, which is also frustrating. And another thing that often gets forgotten is, where do we park our car? It sounds really obvious, but it's often forgotten. And wedding venues can be a real nightmare for that sort of thing because often you've got to park miles away from where you're actually playing. So there's those sort of logistical things to think about. But I think even before we get to that, another really important thing that less experienced players I see get wrong all the time is personal presentation. So even if you're playing for free or just for friends, but definitely if you're doing a paid gig, you've got to think about the way that you present yourself as a musician all the time. You are like your ambassador. So look, it's worth spending that extra 30 seconds thinking about how you look. Are you wearing the right sort of clothes? Are you presentable? Because at the end of the day, you want to give the right impression to your audience. And I think personal presentation is super important.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, you've got to think about it. It's almost, if it was something else, it'd be like going to a meeting. That's what you're doing. It's a networking opportunity. You might be working for that particular client, but there's going to be other people there, and if you do a good job and you don't look a mess and you play well, then the chances are you're going to get further work, and that's how it works. So you've got to turn up looking smart or looking how you'd expect to be in that venue or that situation kind of thing. It might be a gold twinkly jacket like Chris from Sax School often wears, or it might be a suit, or it might be a DJ. So once again, I mean, this is something definitely to discuss with the client before you go, because you don't want to turn up in a DJ when it's a jeans do.
Yeah, that wouldn't be good.
Or vice versa.
Or vice versa, yeah. Never a good thing when you turn up in jeans and a T-shirt and everyone else is all done up to the nines. And actually, another point that follows on from that is communicating with the band. So we've talked a lot about communicating with the person that you're playing for, but communicating with your band too, so that if you're playing with other people, that you all turn up looking, uniform might be the wrong word, but consistent is probably a better word.
Yeah, well, it's almost one of the first things that I generally discuss with the band. I tell them where it is, how much it is, what time you need to be there, and what we're wearing. That's where the conversation starts when you're booking the band. So it gives you a really good idea as a musician. Say I was being booked by somebody. If someone says we're wearing tuxes, you kind of know what this gig's going to be to some degree. You might not know the kind of exactly what it is, but you've got a good idea of what you're going to need to do for that gig. So yeah, it's really, really important. Once again, it's part of that management and preparation and presentation.
Yeah. So we've talked about the logistics when you get to the gig. We've talked about the way that you present yourself and the way that you talk to the person or the people that you're playing for, and the way you communicate with your band. I think there's one other really important thing that a lot of less experienced gigging sax players fall into, and that is not thinking about the way that you communicate with your audience when you're actually doing your performance. Because I think it's super important to be aware of how your audience are reacting to you. This is really, really important if you're a solo artist, if you're doing something with backing tracks, but equally it's if you're doing a function or if you're playing for an event or a party or something. I think some people who are less experienced maybe have that idea of if you're going and buying a ticket to go see a band in a venue, well, they can kind of do what they want because you've paid to be there. And that's wonderful if you get the opportunity to do that. But for 99.9999% of all the other gigs, you are being paid to go there and entertain the people. And I think it's important to think about what the customer actually, or the audience, want to hear. It doesn't mean selling out, and that's another podcast episode that we can do for sure. But it's just about being respectful and mindful, I think.
Yeah, and judging the situation, the gig, another reason for kind of getting a feel for the place when you get there as well. Because sometimes it's really important that you talk to the audience, and there's going to be other times where it's really important that you don't. If you're background music and they're all there chatting and it's quite quiet anyway, they don't want you kind of announcing your next thing and telling you all about your life and stuff. They just want you to play the next tune, But sometimes you need to actually really engage with the audience, if it's a bit more upbeat, and it is worth talking to them. And that's part of it as well. It's something that I know I definitely struggled with. I mean, I can talk for England normally, but get me on a stage and my mind goes very blank. I've really got to do a bit of preparation and think about the kind of things I'd say. I've got kind of set pieces now that I can say, and also just judging the thing that, you don't want to start telling kind of, let's call them blue jokes when it's, you don't want to be doing those kind of things. Yeah. And I see musicians doing that. They think they're funny, and they think that the things that they're saying, but you just... it's not...
You've got to read the room, don't you?
You've got to read the room. Yeah. You really have.
I think stagecraft is such a massive topic. We could definitely dig into more. And I think one other extension of that too is we're off on a roll today, Joel. I tell you what, I thought this was going to be a relatively quick conversation, and we're going for it. I've got so much to say about this. I hope you guys are enjoying listening to it too. I think one other point that's really important to mention on this topic is the talking, sure, but also if you're in that situation where you're playing improvised music, it's really easy to get carried away, do 55 choruses, squeaky, bonky up high, and all that sort of screechy stuff. And if people are just trying to eat their soup, it's not always appropriate.
Absolutely. I mean, it's particularly, I think, as a jazz band, I think this comes into, because you might be into hardcore Coltrane and all this kind of a bit of Ornette Coleman. Nobody wants to hear that when they're eating their dinner, and it is a really interesting subject from the point of view of my experience with it in this country, because you've got to be able to adapt your playing. And even though there's probably 15 top saxophone players in the country I'd be absolutely happy to dep out a jazz festival gig to, I can think of maybe 2 that I'd be happy to dep out a jazz wedding. And you'd think it'd be the other way around, but I know that those players can temper their style correctly and not just go, well, I do what I do, and just start altissimo and multiphonics midway through a nice kind of a dinner that someone's trying to have. So it's really important that you can change your style, even if it's within a genre, to fit that room. Absolutely critical. In fact, otherwise you're not going to go back there.
Well, that's exactly the point. You're not going to get the call back. And I think for most of us, doesn't matter what your objective is with going out and playing for people, I'll imagine we've all got one common objective, and that is to be asked to come and play again.
Without a doubt.
So hopefully the things we've discussed today will help you guys. And if there are some things that you maybe have noticed that you've done in your early performing experiences, then maybe that's encouraged you to go and try some different stuff and maybe avoid some other common pitfalls as well. So our question this week is from Jin Wei. He's one of our Sax School members. He's new to Sax School, and he was saying that he's really enjoying Sax School, he's loving it, but he's a bit new to jazz. And his question was about the first jazz tune that he's learning. And he said, how come the quavers or the eighth notes are written straight, but when he listens to the way that we play it, it sounds different? What's going on there?
Okay, so obviously in jazz, we play what are called swung or jazz quavers. There's kind of different ways of looking at these, and we can get into that in another lesson. But basically, they sound at least uneven compared to the way they're written. So we get used to reading music, particularly if you're coming from a classical background. If it's written as straight quavers, they're straight quavers. And when you listen to it, or listen to somebody playing that and you see it written, it doesn't look anything like it does on that part. And that's for a couple of reasons. There's a bit more of a triplet feel. Sometimes you'll see this in the top corner of the chart. You might see quavers equal, crotchet triplet to quaver triplet, or we're calling those the whole beat and eighth beat. I don't know. I get confused with all that kind of thing. But you might see that in the top corner, and that's just telling you when you see quavers, actually there's this extra rhythmic element in there. Now, a lot of it for sax players is done with our articulation to some degree, but basically what you're seeing isn't what you're getting in this circumstance. So it's something to be aware of. And if you listen to jazz and you hear them playing quavers, it should give you an idea of the kind of sound that you're getting. So don't be put off. Music's just there as a guide. That's all it's meant to be. It's there to be interpreted, and it's really important to remember whether it's classical or jazz or anything else, the music needs interpreting stylistically. It's just our best way of writing it at the moment. So sometimes these discrepancies happen. So it's worth being aware of these stylistic nuances to some degree.
Yeah, it's a great question, actually, Jen. I'm so glad you asked that, because I think for us who've been doing it for a really long time, we are just so used to, that's swing. It's a swing feel. Well, it's just part of what we do. But if you are new to the whole swing thing, and like you said, coming from a classical background, then it's quite confusing. So yeah, listening and experimenting is the way forward.
Yeah, and not always, I think this goes for loads of things. Don't always assume the piece of music in front of you is literally right, because not only do you get these kind of things where quavers aren't really quavers, but you'll also get mistakes in charts. And if you're
not in Sax School charts,
of course not. Of course, they're edited to perfection. But you come across it all the time. People make mistakes. They're written by humans. Humans make mistakes. And if you hear that note's a B, not an A, and that's what your ear's telling you, then it's probably a mistake, So you've got to trust yourself a little bit in your interpretation of these things as well, which I think is something, once again, you learn over time, that it's not everything is as it seems.
There we go. Well, hey, thanks for this conversation today, sticking around. And I hope you really found that useful. And don't forget, if you want to download the full PDF from this episode, you can find that over at saxschoolonline.com/podcast.
And also, don't forget, you can sign up for the 14-day free trial and get stuck into all the great resources we've got in there right away.
Yeah, there's thousands of students in there, and it's such a friendly community. We have a lot of fun. They're certainly loving your lessons, and there's so much other stuff going on in there too. We'd love to see you in there. So that's it for today. Thanks for watching. Keep practicing hard, and we'll catch you next time.